long ago I was interested in music of protest and coming out of different wars and conflicts. It's not even clear how to name certain aggressions. And by the way, Lacan's work on aggressivity and paranoia is very, very important to understand war and the way that territory has been feminized and maternalized in a certain way, which we will discuss. But in any case, in terms of the music, there's a certain haunting that takes place when you can't get some music out of your head, no matter how silly it is. I think you know about that. In psychoanalysis, that's been also an object of some consideration. But sometimes when I write, and I'm already responding to Jamie's question about writing and phobia and mechanicity and the technology of writing, you know, and you're just sitting there, and it is a question. It's very bizarre sometimes to send people off after we've had this kind of whatever it is, we haven't defined it, encounter or session or Sitzung or relatedness or an abyss of relation. What's this hole here? How do we signify it or something? So you send people off, you say, now write your dissertation, now write a paper. What kind of solitary confinement are you consigning the person to, and what kind of extreme acts of submissiveness are being required, requested, or demanded of the other? What kind of schizophrenic distress is being legislated? These are things that are rarely discussed or questioned about the pedagogical scenes of notation, of self-testing, of examination and testing, and so on. By the way, the assignment for our course will be, let's continue with the letter then. Okay, forget it. I'm almost embarrassed to tell you, but in the sense of the great intimacy that we've achieved here so far, and this may break it, of course. Sometimes I'm sitting there in great isolation, and it must revert to something in childhood, or maybe not, where everyone else goes out to play. Do you have this? And you're tethered to your writing machine. Do you have this? And it requires great discipline, isolation, practice, like practicing an instrument. And the only one on your case is Superego saying, that's it, you know. This is what you've spent years in the archives for. Did you look at that sentence? Is that what you come up with? Anyway, so there's a moment where I resist Superego. And one of the war protest songs, when I get back into the field of action, which you must know is, and I'm not good at singing because I haven't practiced singing, but it's 1, 2, 3, what are we writing for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next stop is Vietnam. And then I can write again. Exactly. So there's a kind of, and I say this, it's her fault that I'm even, you know, I'm Josephine, the mouse singer from Kafka here. I'm squeaking or screeching at the limit of my authority, which has just vanished. But it would be more horrifying if I had a beautiful voice, right? If I suddenly belted out, that would be even more horrifying. So I did us all a service by singing with a broken voice. So somehow, or recently, I've had another symptom. Are you interested? Maybe you don't want to hear these symptoms.
I enjoy Country Joe.
Okay, but this really is fucked up because I had to rev up my engines So I wanted to remember, and it comes from, maybe it's primal aggressivity or some me, sweet me. And I've been listening to, but it has to be degrading, abjecting. It's not, you know, like last night Ravel or something like that. No way. It was, I'm proud to be an Okie from Muskogee. But I'll tell you why. Do you know this? We don't smoke marijuana in the courthouse or what. We still fly Old Glory at the courthouse, you know. We don't take our trips on LSD, you know. So why do I need this shit, vulgar music? Because it reminds me, in my case, of what I'm up against and what I'm fighting. The banal vulgarity. I'm not saying I'm not there with banal vulgarity, okay? There's no opposition here. However, it somehow is like the moment before a fight, I think, you know, when the coach is smacking the fighter and putting the mouthpiece in, or somehow you're getting ready and equipped. Okay, this is me in my schleppy little study, imagining everything that I have to summon and bring together. And it's often just like when with this Tea Party, I'm not going to go there, but anyway, you know, on the one hand, it's a quasi-dialectics. You say, why bother? I mean, really, why bother figuring out what Heidegger meant in a thing that no one gives a shit about? And why spend weeks on this sentence? And then somehow remembering, so this is where it turns over, remembering all of the desecration or violation of thoughtfulness by means of these ridiculous, sometimes, songs, I don't know, vitaminizes me somehow and prepares me. And it is, for me, a fight. It's also a physical struggle. It's labor. I don't know if you feel this way when you write. You're exhausting and depleting yourself. It's not necessarily on the side of health. A lot of people need to pump up in all sorts of ways in order to write. Now, the physicality and the demandingness and the athletic achievement of writing is perhaps something that is rarely noted or mentioned. You really also, and this is why in the Platonic systems, and by the way, Friedrich Kittler has asked, when was the gym appended to the university in certain cultures, right? And of course, gymnasium is an institutional, it's a school, it's a moment of study, of high school and so on. So the athletics, the sheer athletic exertion that goes into writing, and how you have to keep in form, in shape, to be able to write and knock yourself out all the time, is something that I also wanted to mention. So that's the war zone at home.
Yes, I wanted to go back to war zone too, and maybe link some questions about are we all soldiers here, and is it what are the compelling war zones today and before, and even the bone question, what is it to go back to the bone, to the skeleton of it, and the helmet, also the technology that is it always a defensive one? I think psychoanalysis is not only about the discovery of Freud. It comes also for me from the war zone and the psychiatry of war. And in this sense, Rivers is a very important person of in the First World War. And what he came upon, because the English had this problem that usually when you were on the war zone and you refused to, or you couldn't be a soldier anymore, you were just shot, because that was desertion. But they came up with a new category of soldiers. They were decorated, very courageous soldiers, especially brilliant, I would say, ones. And suddenly they couldn't anymore. And they could not just say they cowered, or suddenly they have fear, because so they brought them back to England to cure them as insane. That was the only way they could not shoot them on the judgment. They had to go to a martial court, be declared as insane, and Rivers took these patients but of course to put them back to the front. That was nothing, of a hard understanding, except that he was a genius too. So he understood that what happened in especially the front zone that Patočka also wrote upon, that is calling it the solidarité des éprouvés, meaning that the first zone that you were calling upon in the Foucault metaphor, they are brothers, in fact, because they are most exposed, and you're not anymore related maybe to the nation, the problem of the nation, but of why do you shoot your brother? That's just on the over tranché. And but what he came upon is what I would call the corps à plusieurs. It's
multiplicitous body, or
yes, for one soul. That is, most of the time, those soldiers that could not shoot anymore, or were completely haunted with nightmares that reduced them to nothing, really like an anorexia, I would say, very severe one. They would not aliment themselves anymore. They would let themselves die, and not knowing even why. I mean, it was not said as a protest, for example, against the war. It was just said as, I can't anymore. And in fact, he understood that they made one body with the other, and another that was usually shot just near them, and that at that moment became part of them. And so this embodiment of the other is what can happen also in severe psychosis, but it can happen to any one of us, I guess, in this trauma zone. And he tried with what he called expectancy, proximity, and awareness to bring them slowly to their own self and body, and to be able to abandon the soldier to the death and not join the other in the death, whether it was wanted or not, and to reanimate themselves in that movement. And I think we have to take lessons, teaching from that, because this corps à plusieurs is present today also in various ways, and in those silent war zones that are not identified as such. It's not about shooting anymore, but it's about disintegration also zones. And Arendt was said that when one was put into exile, or went into exile, he brought with him two only important things. That was his language and his dead. I mean, and what was he to do with it? Because he could be completely, and sometimes had to be, dispossessed of his language in order to enter the country that would welcome him or her. And the dead were usually left in sometimes open space, not even with graves. And what was he going to do with the memory of them and the transmission? And I think that's the legacy of the question that's very important too, for when we think about fighting, encountering, being called upon to respond.
Do you mean that the multifaceted body, or the corps à plusieurs, incorporates the dead?
Yes.
Identifies with?
Yes.
And then becomes phantomal itself?
It's like a spectral inhabitation, inhabiting the self, so that it's not only about a nightmare or a visitation, it's really an embodiment. It goes down to the bones, to the flesh, and it inhabits the soldier or the patient. And you can, River said, you had to address both at the same time. You had to address the living person here, but always thinking and remembering you were also addressing this forever dying person that could not have rest, and that definitely was not resting in the memory of the brotherhood in as a soldier that was created by the event. But that's true of trauma, incest, of an accident. I mean, it's a very severe accident where suddenly I remember one patient she was her father died with 4 children the father and the mother died, and the 4 children were alive in the car, and somehow those 4 children are forever together, related to that event. And she was embodying not only the dead but the whole family present in this car. And what are we doing when we address corps à plusieurs? What is the sense and the signification of an encounter? We always are multiple, of course, first as a self, but we are in a way carrying, as Arhand said, this language as almost a translating language already, this memory of the dead, but also to be in capacity of being in the present, and to maybe not return back to the war, but at least be alive. Take account for what is inseparable, and that is asking for forever, to be responded of.
So do you want to respond and refine and help us launch?
It's interesting that films of that time, and I'm thinking here of the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, always represent that body, a figure, a shadow, of course, on the screen, as being possessed and haunted. And there's also another modality of that, so the figure of the mesmerized comes in. And there's always a kind of attempt at a cure, which is to allay that restlessness, to have a kind of calm for the shell shock would be the English term for the shell shock. And the tragedy, of course, is that there is no respite, and the film goes on to other tropes. But I think that figure of the possessed, the haunted, the mesmerized, is a very direct response to the Higgs and Rosen, and to what people found coming out of that terrible thing.
And it's true that you're right, and also that it was called afterwards, but that's why I didn't mention it at first, the guiltiness of the survival. But when you say that, you already close the field, like if you had to surpass this guiltiness, just work on it. Like, now it's said you have to overcome the mourning, for example. You always have to overcome. And somehow, for me, the genius of Rivers was to say it can't be overcome. It can be talked with. It can, if you can come at rest with the idea that you've abandoned this person to the death, even if you couldn't do anything, and you can confront this void separating this person that has disappeared in yourself. But as long as you don't try to resolve it, and that's about, I think, maybe to me, the fight complex, is that fighting maybe not so much a dialectical movement towards resolution, such as maybe a cure is not about curing oneself, at least not in the sense of it's resolved, but as maintaining together opposite elements in yourself or in your history as such. And this possibility of containment, is in itself the ground for creativity, for example. And it's letting be visited by thrilling and worriness, and sometimes quelle heißt es? Lassitude, but in a way that is not it's not putting you under this obsessional question of I have to choose. No, just I have to listen would be maybe the idea.
So I'm being washed over by all of these questions and their strong velocities, and I'm trying to choose. And another quality that disqualifies of a obsessional neurotic is that they can't choose, they can't decide. It's like rat man. I'm now, while Anna's talking, I'm other cultures, I'm figures of poetry, I'm Heidegger's Es gibt, so I've been exhausting myself, trying to the feminine, trying to the phallus, having the phallus, and so on and so forth. So I'm exhausting myself, fighting with myself to try to bring focus to one of the questions. And what comes up also, because I would say there's no zone that is not a war zone on some level, which is probably why Kant had to abandon his effort to write on perpetual peace. So Kant even says, what is it to imagine peace? Aren't we consigned to the cemetery finally? Because peace is restful. Nothing in or outside or near the human spirit in its striving and questioning and desiring wants to be at rest, except right before, beyond the pleasure principle. That's a different kind of, let's say, dimension of the death drive. But let's just stay with Kant for a moment. And what would it be to imagine or give peace a chance? Kant really addresses this and breaks off. And so we also have to read the interruptions and the disrupted text, the thwarted or aborted effort, read where things stop or can't go on, they must go on. This is why maybe Lyotard says our ethical duty is to enchaîner, link up with that which just stops short or stalls or falls away, and try to read that falling away and that which doesn't offer itself up to a reading. But Kant also has something to say about the theorist in this text, about perpetual peace. And he points out that the philosophical writer or theorist is always subject to bashing and to being devalued. Like maybe some of your families are wondering what you're doing here, I'm not sure, or what you're doing with your time. And there's a devaluation that comes from everywhere, and a superegoical complicity sometimes with, what the hell am I doing? Is it practical enough? Is it real enough? Is it this enough? Is it active enough? Is it doing what I would like to do, namely change the world enough? Where do I fall short? How can I get out of it? So Kant is very alert to the constant devaluing of the kind of work that, let me say briefly, and for the sake of getting us somewhere else perhaps, or getting us here, that we share, the kind of work of philosophizing and theorizing gets devalued. But he points something out. He says, at the same time as it's systematically and radically devalued and undermined and demeaned, this type of work, it also arrives, if it should arrive, as a kind of menace and threat, and people want to kill it and stop it, and they tell you that it's, so you have this double apparatic, kind of double-barreled response system to the kind of work that I'm saying loosely we're doing, which is, it's meaningless and worthless and to be devalorized, but it's so important that I have to put a stop to it. That there's a lot of, the familiar term is theory bashing and so on. So Kant addresses this predicament and says, can't we cut a deal with the state? You leave us alone and we will continue to bug you and bugger you where necessary and disrupt you, with the understanding that we're just shooting blanks. We're firing blanks. So he does use a kind of military figuration to say what philosophical, critical, or theoretical work does. It does shoot, and it shoots its mouth off, but it's firing blanks, so no one's going to get killed, which is questionable by theoretical maneuvers or incursions. But you, on your part, lay off us. Let us do our work and stop the bashing and stop the shutdowns. And some of the shutdowns are pernicious, like the taxes will be diverted from the arts and literature and thinking and put in more important things, the poor, everyone and everything, among which Kant counts thinking, everything that's fragile will be cut out of the budget systems of great states. The states will allow for great music to glorify them, but thinking is another issue. So Kant says, make up your mind. Either we're meaningless and harmless, so back off, or we're so dangerous that let us declare enmity and let us empower ourselves. But let us all recognize that what the theorist does is shoot. Okay, there's shooting going on, but it's blanks. So it's not like the other is always bulletproofed in terms of the philosophical incursion. And nonetheless, we have a whole history of the philosopher getting in trouble, getting arrested, getting murdered in one way or another, starting at least, I mean, some of them aren't necessarily named or in my archives or retrieval systems. Socrates, right? What was his crime? But the state had to put a stop to it. And Hannah Arendt points out, since you brought her to our table, welcome, Hannah. She points out that the state murder of Socrates, okay, Nietzsche has other stuff to say. He goes, why does Socrates walk into his murder, to his execution? He's already a Christian. What's the matter with him? He didn't fight the power. He wasn't fighting, he just capitulated to power and preferred death to life. But Hannah says to us, this shows that the state is always ready to put down the philosopher. And there's always a moment where the state will say, fire. You know, the state holds its fire for certain strategic reasons and so on. But the insurrection that philosophizing and theorizing at least implies, a lot of it falls flat and short and woefully self-congratulatory, complacent, and full of shit, and so on and so forth, as it booms around on its purported truth serums and all that. Okay. Nonetheless, there's something intrinsically and inherently threatening about it, medusoid maybe even, because it petrifies the other, it shocks the other. There's something just powered and motored by destructive capacities that is understood about philosophizing. Now, Socrates himself said that theorizing, philosophizing is like a gadfly on the state. A gadfly, how big is that, by the way? I don't even know what a gadfly is.
Small.
Small. So that interests me in terms of the Kafkan speck that can bring the whole house down. It's these small termite-like things, barely visible, that can bring the whole house down. So here you have something that is kind of Levinasian, because Levinas says, I'm tired about all of this virility and pumping up and powering up with the void and nothingness, when what we need is weakening. And Kafka does this, and even Socrates, gets small and weak, downsized in order to attack. So the gadfly is that which irritates, and I had the word irritation in the beginning, which I skipped over to explain fighting as well. What about, in our seminar, we're talking about the rights of nerves, but what about the irritants, the irritation, the Agent Oranges in our lives, and the and other levels of warfare, okay, daily warfare, that are not even, that fly beneath the radars, that don't have much to do with the big fanfare. By the way, something to think about, which would interest me, is also military music, and why the drills are often accompanied by a chant, often misogynist, of course. Zizek likes to remind us of some of them. Why does military formation and information need to be accompanied by music? What does music do from the Dionysian to the post-future, so to speak, to make the heroic phantasmata of war come together? And you've seen that even in popular articulations or disarticulations, like Wagner coming back as the war chant, right, in Apocalypse Now, and Wagner as war music, or also in the bombings of all the Gulf Wars, there's always, before the ground troops or the bombings take place, there's always everyone on earphones listening and pumping up and amping up on music, and also watching pornographic videos. So all of this intensity is something to think about when we think about war zones, which also enter the orifices and enter the ears that can't be closed, as Freud reminds us time and again. So there's a real intrusion through the ear. By the way, all of Hamlet is organized around that intrusion and what goes through the ear. It starts with the whisper goes, right? That's how Hamlet begins, and the membrane of the curtain and the poison of the ear that gets circulated through Hamlet. So there's something, and this is the way also America has found to torture some of its enemies. I don't know if you even remember the music blasting of Noriega and others, which is the punishment, the pre-waterboarding punishment system involves music also, which is to drive you crazy with unending loops of music. So I'm just saying that there isn't a limit to war, and even music wars in a family, when the parents are disturbed by the blasting of teen or tween or whatever music, and there's music wars in the domestic space. So there's something to do with noise and with the volleys that are addressed to the other. So back to Kant, even and especially acts of philosophizing are involved in some sort of girding up for war. Not even to mention the common patricidal attitudes and behaviors of philosophers. Each philosopher has to slay the previous one. Have you noticed? You know, and that's part of an aggression that we don't want to simply not think about. But I was thinking in terms of your question about figures of poetry and things that can't be expressed by language. I wouldn't say concepts that can't be expressed by language, because concepts are inherently linguistic. And it's true that there's a tendency toward hyperlinguisticity, I would say, also in Lacan. Language is in overdrive all the time, and it should be in so many ways, but there are certain things that sail us into the depths of and the places of the unsayable, of what can't be said. That's where poetry ventures, but very often with warlike winds in its sails. Poetry often sees itself in warrior terms. We haven't even talked about the figure of the warrior. Poetry often has everything to do with singing the praises of Achilles or this hero or that fallen hero, of the losses that you're counting too, which is to say, how do you incorporate or resuscitate the undead killing machine? What is a militarized body? Even one could want to think about the body, the Jewish body, from the shtetl to the militarized Israeli body. And what happens again in the gym to pump up and to militarize your body. But I was thinking also in terms of the great writer Kleist, Heinrich von Kleist, and his introduction of what I would call military strategies. Because for him, he was a great, great military man in the sense of an aristocratic bearing. By the way, Nietzsche had that too. I don't know if you know that Nietzsche was in the military. He was a great horseman. He was unfortunately myopic, so once he jumped on the saddle and he missed, and so he kind of got himself pierced and infected, and that was the end of his career. I think you know how Nietzsche ended, right? Who knows? He was walking in Torino, and he saw that a horse was being beaten, and he couldn't stand it. He couldn't take it, and he threw himself and embraced the horse's neck. That was the last sane, insane moment of Friedrich Nietzsche. That was it. That broke him. So his relation to horses, by the way, in the army, he was often assigned to cleaning up horse shit. He was in the stables a lot, but he was the best rider. He had a great military formation. I'm saying this, I know you think I'm saying it suddenly like maybe some fascist or something. If we could think fascism without Nazism, which is unthinkable, but it should be possible, there's something about the military discipline that surreptitiously and in a stealth way also infiltrates literary and philosophical study. We talk about strategies, textual strategies. Things are under surveillance. There are approaches. These are all secretly also informed by military maneuvers. There's a whole practice of vanquishing, of getting in there, and this is something that Kleist understood. Kleist understood that the maneuvering and the way the cartography of literary advances and retreats. What does it mean to beat a retreat? To be iced by the weather, and you can't, your armies of tropes can't move on, and so on and so forth. I'm condensing, and perhaps we're too tired to hear the condensation right now. But there's always been before, thinking we know which side we're on and what we're against and what we're for. We need to have our shit detectors on and alert systems, and also look in the first place to see the complicities between the poetic, the philosophical, the literary, and the military. It's a no man's land in our, loosely said, way of being and thinking. But the poetics of military decision, of a reading for meaning, of the mobilizations that occur in and outside of literature, philosophy, and psychoanalysis, possibly need to be read together, if only to attend to the scandal of that kind of replenishing that they take from each other. Now, to return to my man, the rat man, Mr. Obsessional Neuroses, it all starts during a military maneuver. And what happens is they're practicing. So what's the difference between practicing, drilling, and really shooting? This is something that Kant already urges us to consider. And he loses his pince-nez, and that starts all of the symptoms come up. What does it mean to lose a pince-nez? In Freudian territory, it means a lot, because as some of us discussed yesterday, for Freud, being cultured and having rectitude and being moral means that you've been able to distance yourself from the animal smells that come from anal zones and like doggies and all that. So the pince-nez is part of a whole system of repression. Pince-nez literally means that which pinches your nose. It's those glasses, from the early 20th century that were just sat on one's nose. So what happens to Ratman on a military maneuver? And a lot of the structures of neuroses, I would dare say, also derive some of their strength and the way one has to decide where to attack or approach and so on, in a secret complicity with military mappings, which are erased from some of our screens, understandably, because there's such a phobic relation. Now, this might sound like the rantings, the ravings of a mad person. Can anyone help?
No, I just wanted it can make a link from what you've just said and the question about the other cultures, where psychoanalytical field can take account of other ways of approach. It's not, there isn't that much work on it that I know of, but what in this book we at a certain point we were going through figures of transgression, and you came upon the figure of the koan and the Zen,
that's true,
the master and disciple relation, and the going up to the verge of absurd, what we would call absurd, that is to, for example, build a wall and take it down and rebuild again until the disciple understands that there's nothing about the sense of building the wall, but about...
So let me explain. Can I give context,
yes.
Or will I interrupt your thought? So in one of the discussions with Anne, and this was then part of the book called The Test Drive, I was thinking of ways of testing and proving, the proving grounds of the culture of the other and other cultures as well. Is testing only something that the West insists upon? To test one's mettle in Shakespeare, the way we test ourselves. For Nietzsche, you owe it to yourself to take on the hardest test. The hardest test for Nietzsche is to disidentify with everything you've been identified with. Your country, your family, your training, your career, just break off. So there's an ethics of breakup in Nietzsche. Now, one of the questions that we approached then was, does the test and its peculiar restraints and constraints and qualities extend to other cultures? And then we started talking about the koan. Do you know what that is? Yeah? Who wants to say?
You can say just a word about it. Yes, just tell a word.
So it's a puzzle, a Zen, in Zen practice, a puzzle that the master gives to the disciple. And you're asked to figure it out and come back. And then you come back with your purported answer, and the master will very likely smack you and say no. And then there's the stories of that Anne was just referring to, of disciples being told, now go and stand in front of a wall for 9 years and then come back to me with an answer, because your presumption, not only of an answer, but that you think you can question, is so misguided. Go. So I was trying to think about testing in so-called other cultures in the East, and the harshness of the test, but also the specific codifications of testing, because there's certain things that might not be receivable in the West, even though the West is an absurd totalizing notion. There's many Wests and many fragmentations and fissuring going on. So that, for example, when the master beats you or violates your body, we very loose here, might tend to want to interpret that as a true intrusion and unacceptable. Whereas for the Zen body, about which I was doing research, to be struck by your master is the greatest compliment. It's more on the you wish level here. In other words, you can't simply reduce it to masochism, but to be struck and touched and violated by the master is part of the encouragement, in the slow-mo sense of that word. Gives you courage and courage to go on, to incorporate the scar that's been dealt to you, or the blow that's been dealt to you, is part of the testing apparatus that I was trying to install or read out from certain Eastern texts and narratives. So there's a lot of ways in which jostling or soliciting the other, Derrida reminds us that soliciting comes from the Latin, which means also to shake you up, to arouse you, to awaken you. To assume that that's nonviolent or neutral is madness. Now, there's different cultural experiences of the wake-up call, or the shakedown or the shake-up that happens. How do you accept, and what bodies constructed where welcome, invite, and beg for the shake-up, and what bodies are shielded and defended against such an intrusion, or think they are. This comes back to Ratman, through which orifice does teaching or learning or analyzing move through in your body?
I think also that's maybe the link with what stays very transgressive even today in the psychoanalytic motion, and not the coaching one, not the psychological one. Society is being more and more psychologized, and this is going reverse, I think, from the real psychoanalytic motion, in the sense that it's all about addressing the other. It's this amazing proposition that you can be your own medicine doctor. You can know about yourself as long as this inner language, with free association, the freer you can come upon, is addressed to someone, and to someone that doesn't answer. It's not a conversation, a session. Of course, the psychanalyst can talk, but he's not responding. And this silence could be seen as in the koan, that the puzzle, how do you say that? The puzzle is never answerable. Not because the master will stay the master to be acknowledging the disciple, but because both are in front of this unknownability of the unanswerability of the question, and the way that you can be recalled of is going through the non-answer, the silence of the psychoanalyst or the master in this Zen zone.
That's what's important too, that the master is empty too, in this vis-a-vis. The master is empty. It would be preposterous to think that the master holds knowledge. That's very important.
And this is why, if you don't go back, for example, as an analyst, always your test, your trial, is to go back to the point where you don't know anything about this person, that the diagnosis that came upon you when you first met is endlessly being re-questioned up, and that you can yourself go back to this zone of doubt and of hesitation, and of your own, to be visited by your own unconscious, your own dreaming, sort of daydreaming ideas. Because otherwise, if you can't do that movement in presence of the other, then how come he's going to be invited to do so? And it's this, it's a sort of dance, not in presence of a void, but as the possibility that the joy comes out. Psychoanalysis is not so much about anguish than about possibility of joy, I think.
In France, jouissance, they think there's still some joy to be had. So I'm really thinking about all of the questions that I would like to begin answering that you've raised, and I'm distressed that can't happen. I looked at the cell phone telling me that it's time for you to eat the other, and I'm barely, I'm sitting here in a rodeo myself, barely hanging on, because there's so many levels of écoute and listening, and the silences and the projections that are going on, and listening to Anne and you and your questions, they're resonating in me. So I want to apologize that time has passed, and we only began to speak to one another, but that we began is what's tremendous and inassimilable, and that I found you, or you found me, and I found all of you somehow in these sublime Alps, and we're trying to work this out. Some of my pedagogical disarticulations involve most provocative way of making statements, like saying we're all complicit with military strategies. The very idea of, so I didn't finish by saying that Kleist has a fortress that is attacked, and that would be the literary unsayable, it's assailable and unassailable, it's a traumatic zone. The literary is fighting, I mean, poeticity is for Hölderlin, through even Emily Dickinson and others, our contemporary poet friends and so on. It's always fighting and shuddering against itself and against the pressure zones of the linguistic and the superlinguistic, of what can't be grasped and what needs to be nailed. And that's very aggressive. It's very aggressive to want to name and nail and tag and know and designate and conceptualize. When you put something under conceptual arrest, I don't think we're pardoned from certain types of police action when we approach, or even you can see in the discussions at night here, there's great aggressivity, right? And that may not be an unhappy thing. There's a lot of jouissance and French joy, plenty to go around in these districts of thought. So let's just also wonder to what extent, whether repressed, conscious or unconscious, let that be our koan. To what extent are we fueled by acknowledged or disavowed aggression? And I don't know why, but now we would want to think about all sorts of psychological and psychoanalytical topographies, topologies, cartographies, to understand what drives us at all toward these impossible demands to which we're responding and calls to which we're responding, whether or not we acknowledge it. So I just want to also acknowledge the work you're doing under pressures that you may not even be aware of, but I'm sure you're aware of a lot of them. I think it's amazing and spectacular that you're committing yourself to this kind of work against all odds and in a world that absolutely does not honor the kind of work and creativity and aggressivity that you're able to rally still. So I love talking to you for years now, and I look forward to our continued talk.